Ah, greetings, respected viewers. I'm George from Ireland. I'm at Millbank in London, and this huge stone bollard behind me is one of the only things that remains from the former Millbank Prison, which stood on this site, mostly a little bit further inland, where that busy road is and beyond. So Millbank Prison was constructed in 1816 in this area just to the west of the centre of London. And it was a new style of prison. It was a panopticon, and it was based on the philosophical principles of Jeremy Bentham, with his philosophic calculus and his emphasis on reforming prisoners, giving a second chance. You've got to remember, this was a time when the death penalty was used promiscuously. There were over 200 capital offences in English law, and renowned jurists such as Sir William Blackstone defended the use of hanging to punish even what we regard as petty theft. Even for children stealing food, if it was more than a few shillings, they could be executed, and indeed they sometimes were. Now, increasingly juries would acquit, even though they were sure the person was guilty, because they don't want someone else to send to the gallows. The judge might not sentence the person to death, even if he could. Even if the person was sentenced to death, that person might be reprieved. But anyway, it was widely recognised that this was a really brutal system, the bloody code. So since obviously the United States became independent in the 1780s, obviously no more prisoners were sent over there. So from the early 17th century, prisoners have been sent to America, and actually prior to that, some have been sent to us, to Ireland. We use a bit of a dumping ground for English felons. But anyway, then so they were going to be punished with a fate worse than death, transportation to Australia. So being dispatched to Terra Australis Incognita, as Niall Ferguson said, in the 18th century is a bit like being sent to Mars. And so in January 1788, that first fleet dropped anchor at Botany Bay, New South Wales. Botany Bay is now considered part of Sydney, although the city wasn't called Sydney for quite some years afterwards, till it was named in honour of the Home Secretary. So this bollard was good for tying a ship up. You can see that groove where the rope would go. And for many of these criminals, this spot was their last sight. Well, the last time they stood on land. I can't say their last sight, because they had to sail down the Thames quite some distance till they got to the open sea. And virtually none of them ever returned. And indeed, returning from transportation was punishable by death. But people did occasionally manage it and get away with it. Because this is before photographs. So long as you weren't foolish enough to go to your hometown, nobody's going to recognise you. No passports back then. Anyway, so there we are, Battersea Bridge. Anyway, the prison, it was built on this low-lying ground. Why is it called Millbank? There really was a mill here in the previous century. It was rather marshy, but that meant that there was this jail fever, and quite a few of the prisoners died of that. But was that part of the purpose, that they cited it deliberately just to kill them in that way? And it was like an 8-month voyage to Australia. The prisoners were often be fighting each other over food. And if you fell ill, there was no doctor aboard, you're usually just going to die. Your ship could capsize. The sailors were being provided with lime juice and all the rest of it to fight off scurvy. I'm not so sure about the ordinary prisoners. They got to Australia, and then they had to do hard labour. But they could be redeemed, and after a few years set free and become very respectable citizens. So the idea was giving them a second chance. It was a brutal system by modern standards, but by the standards of the day, it was enlightened. It could have been a lot worse. So yeah, anyway, none of it now stands the old Millbank Prison. The whole area is known as Millbank, and there's Millbank Tower further up that way, which is once the headquarters of the Labour Party, and indeed where Tony Benn lived as a child in a house on that site, Viscount Stansgate, when his father was Secretary of State for India. So what else about transportation? The whole system was ended in 1868. From the 1820s, the death penalty was reformed and not awarded for quite so many offences. They didn't have fair trials of what we would consider to be a fair trial. People were convicted on quite slender evidence. And for example, sodomy was punishable by death. And there was 1 year in which more people were executed for sodomy than they were for murder. And I read a learned article about this penned by a certain J. Enoch Pohl. Wow, a matter of a special interest to him. And the last men to be executed for sodomy in this country, they were put to death in the 1830s. And what was the evidence against them? Well, the testimony was of a man and a wife who were living in the same building, who suspected they were committing sodomy, claimed that they'd peeked through the keyhole and seen them committing it. The man looks, then he gets his wife to look. 2 witnesses saying they did it, against 2 witnesses saying they didn't do it, and on that basis these 2 men were convicted. Was there no doubt? You managed, by squinting for a few seconds through the keyhole, to see them several meters from the door, and you could be absolutely certain that's what they were doing. My goodness. Anyway, you wouldn't get any sort of conviction on that basis these days. All right, anything else to say about Millbank Prison? It was a panopticon, as in this all-seeing eye. Warders could watch them, and the prisoners didn't know when they were being watched. They deliberately separated prisoners, made them wear masks in public, cut off all social contact to break them psychologically, and they thought they could turn wicked men good. And even in chapel, they had to go there and sing, but they were not allowed to converse, but sometimes they managed to actually speak whilst they were pretending to sing and tap pipes and so on to communicate. So that was that. That was Millbank Prison, which stood here. So that's enough about Millbank Prison and transportation.